Well, thank you, and welcome, and thanks for having me here. And I was a little worried about my presentation being a little bit too theoretical or evidence-based, but since Steve used the word theory and evidence and data, I feel right at home, so thank you. So I want to start with the acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara and Yungamba people and pay respect to the elders, customs, laws, and creation spirits of the lands on which we now stand. And I want to acknowledge that these lands have always been places of learning and that they were never ceded. So one of the things I like to say, because I'm a designer, I come from landscape architecture, urban design, planning, those backgrounds, is that great places don't just happen, they're created. And what I mean by that is, yes, we can all create our own spaces, and the kids that are doing that out in the courtyard, they're doing just that. But from a design perspective and from a public space perspective and designers as placemakers, we have to think carefully about what we do and the decisions that we make. So I do think it's important that we take the time and we understand how people use space. So great places, they don't just happen. We don't just kind of put things in the landscape or in a public space. We actually have to create them and take the time to think about it. So again, not to get too academic on you, but the work I'm presenting is part of a book that I co-wrote with an environmental psychologist. So it's about understanding how people use space. And so one of the things we came up with was this concept of theory storming, sort of like brainstorming. But it's taking theory and it's viewing a design problem through multiple theoretical lenses. And the goal is really to generate an evidence-based design. So it's using that data or using that theory or using the evidence so that we know what happens. It's not just anecdotal, even though that's very, very important, and it's not just inherent. So we obviously know how we use space ourselves. But sometimes understanding other people, like the children or other stakeholders, that's critical. So it's using that evidence-based to create design solutions that are creative and inspired, and they're also effective and sustainable for multiple stakeholders. So it's not just, designers are often adults, the policymakers are adults, and so we need to understand how these places affect or how they're impacted by children. So even though as an academic, I like to talk about design theory. I think it's something we can all kind of relate to because it's inherent. So it simply provides an explanation for how we use, how we interact with, how we're impacted by the environment in which we live, work, and play, and that's pretty critical. It also provides this normative suggestion of how we should do things, or so how designers should create places. Because some of you may be in the design space, but we're all impacted by how designers do their work and what design decisions they make. And if we're using public space, we should be knowledgeable about this and we should care about it. So I'm not going to go into all of this, but so the theory storming idea is that you use different theories and you apply them at the same time into a design problem. So there's 6 critical design theories that we talk about, and I'll go into them just a little bit. But they all relate to place. So it's all about how we understand place. So now I'm thinking about the great places that you all use or that you can think about in your own community, your neighborhood, and it's understanding what those mean. So this is a lot of words on the slide, but I'm not going to go into each one. But a couple that I do want to talk about is this idea of affordance. So it's the idea that we put cues in the landscape or a space, and then the individual person who's using that space will understand what activity they can do. So stairs are a good example. So we design stairs in a certain height and width, and then we understand who can use them. So kids might have a different, they're shorter, so they might need stairs of a different height. Or a seat, a chair. You design a chair that looks a certain way. We inherently understand you sit on the chair. So a kid might see a chair, a 2-year-old might see a chair and they think of it as a table, or they think of it as, a cubby, or they think of it as something else. So it's those cues that we design into places or elements in the landscape that give us those activities that we can do. So that's one thing that is important to look at, but also the idea of let's see, sense of place or place attachment. It's how we, designing a place that actually has that strong sense of character of where it is in the world. So we're in Southeast Queensland, we're in, just south of Brisbane, or we're near the ocean, we're in Australia, those ideas of sense of place. So designing places that are not just, they don't just look like they could be anywhere. It's actually, there's an identity there. So it's a community identity. So it's thinking about that when you're actually designing a space. And the last one is biophilia. And so that's actually just about humans' innate need for nature. And so we have this innate kind of relationship with living things. And so we need that. And so it's understanding that idea when you actually design a public space. So child-friendly design is sort of one of the areas that I do research in, but it's thinking about, designing places not just for everybody to use, but it's also where people can thrive, so young people in particular. It's, it's not just we go, we do stuff, we go to work, we go to school, we do whatever, but it's actually enabling us to do what we do really well and to really thrive. So there's one thing, well, obviously, we all know of bad examples. So there's this device called the mosquito device, and I don't know if you've heard of it, but so I'm from the US, and so they do have it there. So it's actually for teenagers mostly, and it was designed initially for prisons. But basically, it's an anti-loitering sound device. So it's an ultrasonic teenage deterrent, and that's actually that's quoted from the website that sells this device. And so it's horrible, right? So it's this high-pitch, high-frequency sound that actually deters loitering. And it's described as being unbelievably annoying to the point where kids cannot stay in the area. So you actually have places that use devices like this. And it's shocking, right? So it just shows me that, not everybody is like this audience. Not everybody really appreciates the importance of creating places where kids can thrive, where young people actually are welcomed and are able to be and kind of can live, their lives. So a couple things about child-friendly design, and so I think this is what everyone's been hearing all day, and yesterday too, but so must consider the children's characteristics. So again, I'll go back to the fact that designers are often adults. Well, we're all adults, and so, but we need to understand children's characteristics. So if they're different than our own, we actually need to understand what that means. Child-friendly design supports children as whole people now and into the future, so it's not just a one-time thing, and then addresses all developmental stages. So again, it's a little bit academic, but we do have policy context for child-friendly design. And you might be familiar with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So luckily in Australia, that is something that you believe in. In the US, they actually have not ratified it, but it's close. But UNICEF Child-Friendly Cities Framework, those, again, are policy level or community level, city level initiatives that give a framework for why we do things, how designers can actually create better communities for children. And then Growing Up in Cities is more of a local initiative, although it's international. And I was part of one of them in Boulder, Colorado, called Growing Up Boulder. So one of the, again, theory is important, but one of the ideas is independent mobility, and really thinking about, young people and how they need to be able to move around the space, so giving them agency, giving them the rights to do things. So young people generally do not drive or have money for Ubers, or taxis, so it's making sure we actually design the community so that they can get around by themselves, and we're not adding those obstacles in their place. So opportunities for independent mobility need to be safe, accessible, affordable, and efficient. And then going places by themselves, obviously, I'm kind of speaking to all that you know, increases agency, confidence, knowledge of their city, and wayfinding skills. And that's something I think we can all improve on, is wayfinding. But then there's also policy that talks about global street design guidelines. So it's designing places like the streets so that they're child-friendly. So it's not just parks or open spaces, but it's also designing streets. So there's some policy on that. And then this idea of shared streets. So you might have heard of in different communities, mostly in Europe, but they have home zones or WUNOFs, a few in Australia as well. But they prioritize pedestrians. So again, it's child-friendly. It's good for everybody, but it also enables young people who might not drive to be able to access shared spaces. Another thing is personal health and safety, so making sure that young people are safe in the community, in the spaces that we design. So obviously children are smaller, they're more susceptible to different things, toxins, that kind of thing. So making sure that we design appropriate spaces. And also, as you all know, their cognitive and social awareness is still developing, so personal safety is much more important. And so we have to pay attention to those. And even if we want to say, oh, we shouldn't do that, but we do really have to focus on that kind of thing and making sure kids are safe in the community. And then, when we do design playgrounds or parks or things like that, it's very important for designers to pay attention to all the developmental options. So physical, not just physical, but cognitive, social, creative development. So all of those, looking at the child as the whole person. So designers definitely need to do that. And I think we all need to be aware of everything that the child needs. And then there's lots of work. So obviously Australia is doing a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of work being done in other countries. So this is, these images are from Indonesia. So they have child-friendly public spaces, the RPTRAs, and they're like parks, but there's also a community center that's part of it. So it's allowing children to learn traditional games and cultural heritage and just actually have a safe space. And so again, it's about giving children opportunities so that they can be in a place, be safe, learn, all their developmental stages are addressed, that kind of thing. And then intergenerational spaces, so it's making sure that adults and children, so even though, yes, focusing on child-friendly design is important, making sure that adults and children can work together so that they can do things together. And that's one of the things, especially in park design, that I've focused on, is making sure that it's designed for intergenerational interactions. So a lot of times you'll see the children playing on the playground and the adults on their phone. And they might need that, and that's fine, but if we can actually get them both kind of active and interacting, that's even better. Okay, so I know you're all waiting for lunch, so I won't take too much more time, but so using theory storming, this idea of sort of brainstorming using theory to address child-friendly design, and I'm just going to go through a scenario of a park, because that's specifically the type of public space that I've dealt with or done research on. And so you can just see how this works. And so hopefully, when you go out to different parks in your own community, you can kind of look at them differently in terms of the different theories that I've shown you. Okay, so how easy you can see this. So all those theories that I showed on that earlier slide are listed here, and it talks about this slide, this diagram talks about the theory and then how we actually relate it to the design of the park. So that affordance theory, that idea of cues when you design something, kind of gives you, sends messages to everybody about how, like different activities that you could actually do with that element or in that landscape. So simple park signage would be an example of an affordance. So they accommodate intergenerational activities or child-sized furniture. So if you have child-sized furniture, that's a space designed for children to use. So it's actually designing a space with those in mind. I won't go through all of these. Let's see, what else did I talk about? So the idea of sense of place. So you can incorporate that by using special themes that educate local history or culture or unique qualities that are memorable. So if you think about where you are in the world, so if you're in Southeast Queensland, using those native plants, using those species, using the types of materials that are local in that environment, and actually using that to teach people or to teach the young people about that community and getting them to relate to that so that we know where we are. And that relates to place attachment, so that we actually have feelings of attachment to a different place, so that we actually grow to care about it, grow to have memories about it. And then the idea of biophilic design, so obviously that's our inherent need for nature, so you can use that in design, just thinking, incorporating nature for exploration and play, and we've heard a little bit about that, but also highlighting even just views of natural areas and what that means, and providing access to that in a space. So I'm just going to go through 2 different parks to show you actually how this comes together and how we make it work. So you can see, and I've kind of highlighted some of the theories here. So this is a park, I believe this is in Hatfield, but one of my good friends, Tobias Volbert, works for Urban Play, and so he was part of the design. He's a landscape architect, and so he designed this. And so it's actually just showing how we've used the theory and why it matters, so that designers actually understand how people interact with space or how they're impacted by space. So the affordances, that's simply, in this example, the shade structures. Obviously, if you see shade structures, you understand you can do certain activities. So obviously, if you're there, middle of the day, heat of the summer, you can still play there and still be somewhat comfortable. It's still pretty hot, but so different affordances, then biophilic theory or biophilic design, access to views of nature, or even having natural elements in the playscape. Personal space, that's an interesting one here, because obviously we're all talking about personal space with social distancing now, but kids have a different, they have different personal space bubbles than adults. So it's thinking that through, and how close you make, those are just little like stepping things, little logs that you can sit on or step on. And so it's thinking, so if you place them in certain distances, actually you're designing for a larger personal space. So you're designing more for adults. When you think about kids, they're all up, they're climbing on us and they're sitting on us, and they have a different sense of personal space. So it's making sure that how you design or how you arrange those attracts them and accommodates their needs. Sense of place in terms of local materials, making sure it actually looks like where it is in the world. And then place attachment, and just actually, again, that's tied into sort of, if they're there every day, they build those sense of memories, and they kind of have a sense of attachment to a place like that. So I'm going to show an opposite example. So this is a very typical park that we've probably seen tons of, and this is exactly what I saw when I first moved to Australia 9 years ago. There's not, so if you think about all those design theories that I just talked about, you can maybe say biophilic design because there's trees in the park, and it's green, leafy area, and affordances because there's a shade structure. But anything else, like there's no real sense of place. Like I've shown my students a park that looks just like that, and it's from Mexico, and they actually can't tell the difference. And so there's no sense of place there. Maybe the trees you can tell from they're Australian, but place attachment. If a kid goes there, if that's in their neighborhood and they go there every day, maybe they'd have a sense of attachment. But there's probably nothing really special for them to really, be like, that's my park. Prospect Refuge, this is one I didn't talk about, but that's the idea of, you can have a view out and be protected. So it's this kind of sense of safety and feeling like you can kind of watch what's happening. There is no example of Prospect Refuge in this park. And then personal space, well, everything's very spread out, so I guess they dealt with that. But yeah, there's nothing that's actually close together that would be, a child's sense of personal space. So it's just actually evaluating the park spaces and the open spaces and the places that we design, that are designed professionally by planners and landscape architects and architects, and kind of looking at how that's been done and reevaluating how we can do it, because I think we can do a lot better. And there is things that we need to know. So we do need to actually form partnerships, but we also do need to do research to understand better about how children are impacted by the places that they use every day, the places that they go to school in or they play in, and understanding what that means, and then using the theory that's based on that research to design better spaces. And that is all. Oh, no, it doesn't come up, but thank you.